Night fell softly over Kahekili Bay, painting the horizon with velvet indigo streaked by thin wisps of cloud. At the edge of the shore, the village fires flickered, illuminating the ancient wooden idols lined up along the beach. The men and women of this coastal community believed deeply in the spirits of their ancestors who dwelt in the sea. One such spirit was the shark guardian, a powerful entity said to watch over them and protect them from harm. Generations of elders would recite myths of how, in times long past, the guardian had led lost voyagers to safe harbours and escorted fishing canoes away from treacherous reefs. But beneath those benevolent tales lay a darker truth. The guardian demanded respect for the sea's sacred rules. Breaking these taboos risked rousing a relentless fury. Old Nuka, an elder whose hair was as silver as the moon's path on the water, often reminded the village's younger fishermen of these spiritual stakes. Removing certain fish without a proper chant, fishing on nights when the guardian roamed certain waters, and disrespecting the gifts of the ocean were all considered kapu taboo. However, times were changing. The yield from shallower waters had dwindled and new fishermen pressed the boundaries, venturing into deeper zones and hauling in fish in ever larger nets. Some insisted the stories were mere superstition, handed down by cautious ancestors. Others tried to keep the old ways but found hunger and necessity winning out every time they cast their nets. Still, a lingering dread hovered over every vessel that left shore without an elder's blessing. Kailani, a young woman who had inherited her mother's net-wiving skills, sensed this growing tension. She also felt her own thirst for knowledge. The nights she spent under the moonlight, twisting and tying cords into nets, were as meditative for her as they were instructive. She listened attentively to old Nakoa's cautionary tales, while silently observing the restlessness of the younger men. A few fishermen scoffed at caution. They believed it was time to outgrow the old constraints. Yet Kailani saw shapeless, flickering shadows beneath the waves whenever she walked along the shore, half convinced the guardian was watching. Some nights she thought she caught sight of a dorsal fin slicing through the moonlit surface. She wondered if it was her imagination. But deep down, she suspected the guardian was keeping a watchful eye on the changing tide of human behaviour. One evening, against all counsel, a teenager named Lakoa set out with 2 companions to fish in a forbidden stretch of reef. Simple hunger wasn't their motivation. They wanted to bag a legendary catch. The reef was rumoured to be home to rare, oversized fish that one could proudly display on the village beach. It was also said to be patrolled by the shark guardian itself, a territory fiercely protected and off-limits. With laughter and bravado, Lakoa and his friends assembled their gear under the cover of light from the torches they used to navigate the rocky path. The trio paddled out in a wide, double-hulled canoe that rocked under the weight of their equipment. Lakoa's heart hammered with equal measures of excitement and fear. He couldn't deny his apprehension each time he peered into the black expanse of water. Yet the potential reward prested within the village and a chance to provide more food won out over caution. Inwardly, he reasoned that the stories must be exaggerated to keep youngsters in line. If the ocean was angry, he told himself, it was only because the fish were becoming scarce, a normal cycle of nature rather than a direct result of broken taboos. The night air felt cooler the farther they went from shore. Stars dotted the sky like scattered blossoms, and the waxing moon lit a pale track over the waves. After a time, the canoes slowed, and they cast their nets into the depths. The waters here were rumoured to be particularly bountiful, ignoring the giant warnings that a giant shark prowled these currents after sunset. The net sank below the surface, trailing rope clipped to the canoe. For a while they drifted in silence, listening to the gentle lapping of water against the hull, half expecting nothing to happen. Then came a sudden pull so strong it nearly flipped the craft. By the flickering torchlight they saw something thrashing in the net below. Lakoa gasped, thrown momentarily off balance as he tried to grip the rope. A monstrous creature struggled to free itself, battering the water with enough force that droplets flew into the canoe. For a heartbeat, hope flared. This could be the prize they sought. Excitement twined with terror. The shape was large, too large, and the net was rent in places by sharp fins and teeth. One of Lakoa's companions gasped, "It's a shark!" But even in that moment, Lakoa saw that this was no usual shark. Its glimmering body seemed unnaturally scaled, as if rippling with an inner power. Fierce intelligence burned in its eyes. Panic seized them. One companion brandished a harpoon to ensure their catch while Lakoa shouted a warning. Something about the creature's gaze convinced him it was more than just prey. The second companion, in a desperate bid to calm the raging water, fired the harpoon. The moment the barbed point struck flesh, an unholy shriek cut through the night, echoing across the bay with such resonance that those upon the distant shore thought an entire storm had descended. The thrashing shark tore a jagged hole in the netting, escaping into open water, but not before the men spotted the dark swirl of blood. Then the night became unnaturally quiet, as though the entire sea held its breath. They sat in stunned silence for a long moment, hearts pounding as the torchlight flickered weakly. Locating the harpoon line proved fruitless. It had torn free when the shark escaped. Fear whispered in Lakoa's mind, telling him they'd made a terrible mistake. They rowed back to the village, uncertain whether they had succeeded in their daring attempt or awakened something far more dangerous. At dawn, villagers found the wounded shark's trail. Broken bits of shell from the harpoon's tip washed onto the sands, streaked with blood. Old Nakoa reached for them, trembling. He turned to the fishermen and demanded to know who had gone out to the forbidden reef. Lakoa hung his head, guilt etched into every line of his face. Mutters spread among the villagers, some in disapproval, others in fear. Who would dare defy the ancient taboo? Why challenge the guardian? Anxious to protect his nephew, Nakoa tried to quiet the brewing anger, but he could not quell the signs. The sky, which had been bright and clear moments before, grew dark with swiftly gathering clouds. The sea, calm as polished stone, began to churn. Waves slapped at the shore like furious reaching hands. Then a strange hush fell over the sands, as though the air itself had been sucked out of the world. A communal dread settled on everyone, magnified by the sudden stillness. From afar, someone cried out, "Haikamano! The shark is here!" But nothing emerged. The senses of the villagers felt heightened, their gazes pinned anxiously to the horizon. The day wore on, the wind grew stronger, and uneasy fishermen hesitated to launch their canoes. That evening, loud barks of thunder cracked overhead, though no rain fell. Lightning snaked across the sky, illuminating the bay in flickers that gave the water an unearthly silver sheen. Near midnight, the ocean's surface shimmered, and something large glided past the shallows. Many villagers cowered in their huts, doors latched and torches committed to the wind's mercy. Those who dared look witnessed a form moving back and forth, occasionally spiking up a magnificent dorsal fin before submerging. It was the guardian, drawn in by the blood spilled at the taboo reef, wounded and enraged. Kailani, who had been huddled in her corner of the net-weaving hut, fought the fear coursing through her. She remembered stories passed down from her mother about how a shark spirit could wander between worlds, taking on human form, guiding families in times of danger. She thought of the possibility that this guardian might be an ancestor who had once protected them. Now it was turning its wrath upon them because they had broken promises. Stepping out of the hut, she gazed at the roiling surf and felt the sting of salt-laced wind on her cheeks. She sensed what she must do. At midnight, when the lightning flared in brilliant arcs, Kailani went down to the shoreline, unarmed, carrying only a small wooden bowl carved with ancient symbols. She filled it with fresh water from a calabash and carefully approached the surging ocean's edge. The sea spray battered her face, but she stood firm. With trembling lips, she recited the chant her mother had taught her, a chant meant to honor the shark guardian, to ask for mercy and healing. She dipped her fingers in the fresh water and scattered droplets into the tide, offering a symbolic gesture of atonement. The next flash of lightning revealed a hulking shadow in the water mere yards away. Though her heart pounded, she held her ground. In that moment, Kailani's voice found resonance in the surf's roar. guardian of these waters, hear my plea. Protector of our people, forgive this wrongdoing." As she sprinkled more water, the stormy crescendo reached a fever pitch. She glimpsed the shark's eye. Too intelligent, too knowing for an ordinary creature, time seemed to stand still. When the gale finally howled and the wave crashed, the figure vanished beneath the churning surface. Kailani collapsed onto the sand, unsure what had just occurred or whether her gesture mattered at all. In the days that followed, the ocean's hostility only intensified. Men who ventured out to fish returned empty-handed, their nets inexplicably torn or carried away by vicious currents. A sense of doom clung to the village like a heavy cloak. Even the skies appeared to revolt, releasing torrential rains that beat at the thatched roofs, while gusting winds bent the palm trees. Whispers of a reckoning spread. Old Nakoa urged the villagers to gather each evening, leaving offerings of taro and fish, along with prayers on the shore, yet the storms persisted. Fear drove people to remain indoors, and many came to blame Nakoa and his companions. The tensions seethed, threatening to fracture the unity of the community. Word reached them from another coastal settlement, a place that had once offended the sea by dumping waste into the water. Their story told of a shark spirit who had come in a vengeful rage, washing away huts and devouring livestock. They had survived by capturing the offending party and casting them into the deep as a sacrifice. Fragments of their myth made the villagers recoil. Was such a brutal price now demanded of them? Lokoa's mother wept at the prospect. Early one morning, under skies streaked blood-red with dawn, an even greater tragedy struck. The caretaker of the village's heiau, the sacred temple, was found floating in the shallows. His limbs bore deep lacerations, and the water around him was red. Nearby lay a broad track in the sand, shaped like a giant tail's dragging imprint, as if some monstrous creature had come halfway onto land to deliver punishment. The old man's staff, used for blessings, was snapped in half as though a direct warning had been issued. If the taboo was not righted, worse would come. Panic took hold outright at that point. Some cried that every taboo breaker must be banished. Others shouted that an enormous sacrifice was needed. Old Nakoa tried to usher calm, but fear had already blossomed into destructive fury. The villagers' anger refocused on Nakoa and his friends. If their misdeeds summoned this evil, it was only fair that they pay the price. Parents who lost children to the storm's waves, or whose houses had been swallowed by flooding, demanded retribution. Nakoa, once so eager to prove himself, now cowered in his hut, haunted by nightmares of a shark's gaping jaws. Kailani watched, horrified, as the villagers' desperation grew. She pitied Nakoa, but also understood the deep sense of betrayal the community felt. Night after night, she continued her solitary offerings by the beach, though they seemed to yield no effect. She even tried to find old Nakoa to ask for guidance, but he was overwhelmed, torn between his loyalty to his nephew and his obligations as an elder tasked with protecting the village. So, Kailani undertook another, riskier course. She sought out the legends of the old gods, gleaning from scraps of knowledge that some guardians could be appeased by a ceremony in which a sacred lei was offered, woven from leaves grown at the highest point of the mountains. This lei, made under pure intentions, might help cleanse the wrongful act. If completed properly, the guardian would accept the penance of the living rather than demanding another life. The next morning, Kailani set off at first light. Shielded from prying eyes, she followed a winding trail into the mountains behind Kaikili Bay. The path was treacherous, slick from the constant rain, and she slipped more than once on moss-covered rocks. Yet she pressed on, forging upward through thick jungle. Mist curled among the ferns. Birds shrieked overhead. She thought of her mother's gentle voice, reminding her that perseverance and love for the community were the greatest forms of courage. Soon she located the grove of native greenery rumored to have healing properties. Carefully she plucked the leaves with reverence, mindful not to take too many from any one plant. She recited a quiet chant, a prayer for permission and forgiveness. A lull in the wind felt like a small acknowledgement. Upon returning, she used her net-weaving skill to craft a woven ring of leaves, twisted tight with hand-spun cords. At nightfall, Kailani marched down to the water's edge where the waves frothed incessantly. Wind whipped at her hair, flinging salt into her eyes. She knelt, placed the lei at her feet, and began a second chant, an ancient plea for the guardian to come forth and witness the atonement. She called Lakoa from the crowd that hesitated near the huts. Slowly and with trembling steps, the youth emerged, tears in his eyes. He, too, knelt by the lei, placing his hands over Kailani's in a show of contrition. Around them, lightning forked across the sky. The ocean thundered an unrelenting danger. For a tense span, nothing happened. Then a foam-laden wave swept toward them, and in the swirl of white water, a colossal shape rose. The guardian's head broke the surface, revealing a scar across its flank where the harpoon had struck. Its eyes glowed with a fierce intelligence, righteous anger mingling with pain. Lakoa shuddered, tears streaming down his cheeks as the huge shark hovered close enough to shore that its dorsal fin briefly appeared in the shallows. With careful deliberation, Kailani picked up the lei, held it high, and placed it gently onto the water's surface. The waves tugged at the woven leaves, carrying the offering toward the guardian. As though guided by an unseen current, the lei circled around until it flowed under the creature's head. At that moment, a deafening crack of thunder split the sky. A torrential downpour battered the beach, drenching Kailani, Lakoa, and the onlookers. The shark's gaze flicked from Lakoa to Kailani and back again, as if measuring their sincerity. Lightning flared once more, revealing the shark's bulk, rearing upward in an impossibility of motion. A roar of water drenched everyone, and for a second, the night glowed white from multiple lightning forks. The next moment, the guardian was gone, vanished in a swirl of tumultuous surf. The ocean's surface boiled for a few heartbeats, then slowly began to calm. The wind abated, the rain diminished to a soft patter, and the dark clouds parted, letting faint moonlight wash across the bay. For a time, no one dared move. Then the watchers erupted in cautious relief. Some shouted thanks to the gods, others collapsed in sobs of thanksgiving. Old Nakoa stepped forward and placed a shaking hand on Lakoa's shoulder. The young man could barely stand, overwhelmed by the enormity of the encounter. Kailani knelt in the sand, her eyes brimming with tears and silent wonder. It felt as if the entire village had just witnessed a momentous judgment, an offer of forgiveness. Yet the message was clear. This benevolence came with the expectation that the ocean's taboos would never again be taken lightly. In the following days, the furious storms did not return. Children ventured outside to play in the sandy lanes without fear of being swept away by torrential floods. Fishermen still approached the water with caution, but they reported less turbulence and fewer vicious currents than before. Catches, at first meagre, slowly rebounded. The hush of dread that had weighed on everybody began to lift, replaced by a solemn resolve to honor the old ways. Younger fishermen submitted willingly to the oversight of elders who carefully chose when, where, and how to fish in sustainable harmony with the sea's rhythms. Lakoa was not spared from consequences. The wave had delivered him into a new sense of accountability. Under old Nakoa's guidance, he spent time helping to restore the temple and craft new carvings to replace the cracked idols. He also learned the intricate chants and blessings that must precede each fishing trip. Through this rigorous education, he came to understand that cautionary tales were not meant to stifle ambition, but to preserve balance. The ocean's gifts could be abundant, but that generosity would curdle into wrath when taken for granted or exploited. Kailani became a figure of respect, not just for her courage, but for her innate connection to the guardian's realm. She shared the knowledge gleaned from her mother's teachings and her own experiences. She taught others how to weave nets with prayers woven into every knot, nets that would catch only what was needed and not harm the sea's protectors. Her ritual offerings became a staple, On full moons, she'd gather with the villagers to chant by the shoreline, praising the shark guardian's watchfulness and beseeching continued harmony between land and sea. Over time, curiosity replaced fear when it came to the guardian. Children began asking about the intelligent eyes they had glimpsed in the waters, wanting to know more about the spirit that both protected and demanded respect. Though the mood in Kahekili Bay grew lighter, echoes of that terrifying time remained. They showed in the temple caretaker's empty seat, a grim reminder that not everyone was granted salvation. Some nights the older villagers would still hear the hush descend on the water, a faint sign that the guardian lingered close. Occasionally, a lone dorsal fin was spotted at twilight, a gliding outline in the fading light. Such sights ushered a collective pause in the villagers' hustle, a moment to remember that the ancient powers were watching. Above all, they kept each taboo carefully. Seasons slipped by, and the day finally arrived when Lakoa, now a matured young man, invited friends and neighbours to watch him conduct a fishing ceremony, his first as a primary fisher since that fateful night. Kailani stood proudly by his side, chanting in unison while he raised a net meticulously crafted under her guidance. The assembled crowd fell silent as Lakoa's voice carried across the water, asking permission to fish, promising gratitude and acknowledging the living spirit within the sea. They lowered the net gently into the calm tide, and when they pulled it up, a modest but sufficient catch of sleek fish glimmered. It was a moment of vindication, a testimony that one could prosper without greed, honouring ancient guardians as allies rather than provoking them as enemies. With time, the story of that harrowing confrontation became a pillar of the village lore, the day the shark guardian bled because of human recklessness, and how the ocean raged in answer. Elders recounted it to each new generation with solemn intensity. They recited the cycle of giving and taking, teaching that the seas are not boundless resources, but living realms inhabited by ancestral spirits who demand reciprocity and veneration. While the memory of the guardian's wounded fury still struck fear into hearts, it also fostered a deeper appreciation. The boundary between man's domain and the oceans was held in delicate equilibrium. One misstep shattered harmony, sending ripples far and wide. Whenever Kailani walked the shore at dusk, she would close her eyes and recall the moment the guardian locked gazes with her. She'd remember the potent blend of remorse and compassion in that sentinel's fierce eyes. She would leave a small offering, a flower, a whispered thank you, a swirl of fresh water poured onto the tide in gratitude for their continued protection and for the reminder that humility must accompany any approach to the sea. As the villagers thrived again, they cherished these lessons. The sea's bounty returned in cycles of abundance, not merely at random. Each time a canoe left the bay, a short prayer was offered, the fishermen mindful that their relationship with the water was a fragile pact. There would be no more reckless hunts in forbidden reefs. This generation, having seen the consequences, preserved the memory so that future children would not repeat the same errors. And in the surging waters beneath the moon and sun, the guardian lurked, a silent sentinel of balance, ever ready to remind all living souls that reverence is owed to the enduring, mysterious power of the ocean.